This is a story that you all know in some form or another, but you may not know this version. But it begins, as many fairy stories do, with once upon a time. Once upon a time there was a kingdom, and the kingdom had a king, a good, kind and just king. And the king had 3 beautiful daughters, and the eldest daughter's name was... well, come on, give me an idea, give me a suggestion. Euphemia. Princess Euphemia. Well, thank you, that's really easy to remember. So Princess Euphemia was the eldest daughter. Her younger sister was Princess... Eugenie, that's fine, Eugenie. And the youngest of the princesses was called Princess Emily. Thank you, that one is easy. So we've got Princess Euphemia, Princess Eugenie and Princess Emily. Now these girls were 16, 17, 18 years old. And one day they came to their father and they said, "Father, we are 16, 17, 18 years old. We are nearly middle-aged." Remember, this story is quite old, and it's about a long time ago. "We are nearly middle-aged," said the girls. "We need husbands. You must find husbands for us now." And the king said, "No. I enjoy talking to my daughters. I enjoy walking in the garden with my daughters. I don't want you to get married yet. There's plenty of time." But the girl said, "No, father. We need husbands now." So the king had no choice. And so what he did was he took an arrow and he wrote upon it, "Princess Euphemia." And then he put the arrow in his bow and he fired. Ba-doink! And the arrow disappeared deep in the forest. And then he took a second arrow and he wrote upon it, "Princess Eugenie." He put that in his bow. Ba-doink! And the arrow disappeared deep in the forest. Then he took a third arrow and he wrote upon it, "Princess Emily." He put that in his bow and fired. Ba-doink! And the arrow disappeared deep in the forest. And then the king said, "Whoever finds an arrow with my daughter's name upon it may marry that daughter." Well, 3 days later, from the forest there came the sound of horses' hooves, and a beautiful black stallion came out from between the trees, and riding it was a handsome prince. And in his hand he carried an arrow. He rode up to the king and the princesses and he said, "All right, my name's Prince Alf. I've come from across the mountains and through the forest, and I have found this arrow, and on it says, Princess Euphemia. She is my wife." Now, do you think Princess Euphemia was happy when she looked up at the prince sitting on the black stallion? She took one look at Prince Alf and said, "Oh, a man! He's mine!" She jumped up onto the horse, put her arms around Prince Alf's waist, and they rode off back to his kingdom, where they were married and lived happily ever after. Well, as happily as you can live when you're married. 3 days later, there came from the forest the sound of horses' hooves, and a beautiful white stallion came through the trees, and riding it was a handsome prince, and in his hand he carried an arrow. He rode up to the king and the princesses and he said, "Oh, hello! My name's Prince Nigel, and I found this jolly little arrow, and it has the name Princess Eugenie upon it. She's my jolly old wife." Now, do you think Princess Eugenie was happy when she looked up at Prince Nigel? She took one look at him and she said, "Oh, a man! He's mine!" She jumped up onto the white stallion, put her arms around Prince Nigel's waist, and off they rode back to his kingdom, where the two of them were married and lived happily ever after. Well, as happily as you can live when you're married. 3 days later, there came from the forest the sound of... No, not horses' hooves. 3 days later, there came from the forest the sound of beating wings. An ugly black crow stood in front of the king and the princesses, and in his beak he held an arrow.
have found the arrow with Princess Emily's name upon it. She is my wife.
And the king said, No. That cannot be. It has to be a prince. It has to be a prince. And Princess Emily looked at her father and said, But when you fired the arrows, you didn't say that. You said, Whoever finds an arrow with my name upon it. You have made your promise, and I must marry the ugly old crow. And she did. Princess Emily did not go back to a kingdom with the ugly old crow, but she only went back into the forest with him. And there he showed her to a small hut at the base of a great tree. And there she lived in the hut, while he lived in a nest above her. And every day he brought her food and sat and talked to her. And every night he went back to his nest, leaving her. And though she never wanted to marry an ugly old crow, she realized that she was starting to look forward to the mornings when he would come and sit and talk with her, until one terrible morning he didn't come to her. She waited all morning. Noon, still no crow. Afternoon, still no crow. As the sun began to set, still no crow. But then suddenly the door to her little hut was thrown open, and through the door fell the crow, with an arrow piercing his chest. The princess looked down at him. She never wanted to marry an old crow. But as she realized he was dying, the heart in her chest broke. Gently, she lifted the arrow from the crow's chest. And as she did so, he breathed his last and died. The tears fell from Princess Emily's eyes, and to say goodbye to her husband, the ugly old crow, she put a kiss on her fingers and placed her kiss on the wound where the arrow had entered his chest. And the moment her kiss touched him, he started to breathe again. The moment her kiss touched him, his feathers began to fall out. His legs grew longer, his wings became arms, his beak shrank into his face, until lying in front of her was not a dead, ugly old crow, but a living, handsome, very handsome prince, who had been turned into an ugly old crow by a witch until he could find a woman who would love him in that shape. And I could tell you that Princess Emily and her prince went back to his kingdom or to hers, but I'm not going to. Because as far as I know, they stayed together, living a simple life in the forest. And as far as I know, they really did live happily ever after. And that is the story of the Crow Prince. And that is how I have told it to you.